the things when we start talking about equity is really the difference between equality, which is providing the same thing to every individual. That really doesn't translate to equity. These are some significance here in 1994 with this executive order. This is really what we have known over the last couple of decades of what environmental justice, this concept of environmental justice here. And I want to kind of show a few differences of where we're seeing the change in language. So in 1994, that focus was on impacts. Now, Justice 40 is shifting the focus of how we think about projects and the funding of projects to benefits. Justice 40 comes from requiring 40% of federal investments to have a benefit. Those benefits be accrued to historically underserved and disadvantaged communities on here. So here are some of the areas that Justice 40 has come up with. In 2021, the U.S. Department published an equity and access policy statement. The next document is their strategic plan. And then in April 2022, the US DOT put out an equity action plan. The key performance indicators are wealth creation and then intervention. It's really significant that we've got $23.4 billion of funding that's really been made available through Justice 40. The DOT, the Secretary Buttigieg announced just in a historic amount, $185 million in grant awards to 45 projects across the country through this new program. And it's really the first of its kind that is trying to connect communities that have historically been cut off from opportunities and sort of burdens from past infrastructure projects. There is a tool that was developed by the White House. It's the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, and that'll help you identify if an area or community is a disadvantaged community. So this is the Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, and this is an interactive mapping tool. At HNTB, we've kind of taken this the next step further, is actually integrating those tools to sort of a custom maps.
So SCAG, or the Southern California Association of Governments, this region spans roughly a quarter of the state's land area, but houses nearly half of California's population. It includes 6 counties, 191 cities, and 16 tribal governments. SCAG is the nation's largest metropolitan planning organization, or MPO. Here are our key responsibilities. We intentionally follow a learning or a growth mindset and not a best practices approach. We use priority equity communities to compare outcomes versus the rest of the region when we're evaluating the policies and projects included in the plan. Employing a growth mindset, we use an engagement process to get feedback on how we should be engaging. SCAG recently gained the responsibility for selecting projects to be funded with upwards of $500 million annually. We developed a competitive performance-based project selection process, which includes equity as one of 5 scoring criteria. On the federal and state side, revenues are mainly from fuel taxes. As noted, these revenues are declining, and while fuel taxes at one time could safely be considered user fees, the nexus to use is weakening. On the local side, local option sales tax measures, like Measure A in Riverside County or Measure I in San Bernardino County, are often the largest sources of revenue for transportation investments. It's also important to note that local option sales tax measures are controlled locally and require voter approval. It's important to note that any price tied to travel, even the absence of one, will have an impact on behavior. Shifting back on the state and federal side on the fuel tax, these are also regressive, albeit they tend to be less regressive than sales taxes in general. However, there's a growing equity issue in that those that can't afford to purchase an electric vehicle are increasing. Within California, SB 1 includes a modest fee for EVs, but it's about a third of what the typical fossil fuel powered vehicle pays.
So the state designated us as the County Transportation Commission, which means we're responsible for the allocation of state and federal funds that come to San Bernardino County for transportation purposes. We became a county transportation authority when we passed our first sales tax Measure I. The first one started in 1990. We renewed it in 2004. That renewal started in 2010, and it expires in 2040. SBCTA itself is governed by a 29-member board. It's representatives of the 24 cities in our county and then the 5 county supervisors. But a lot of our budget right now would be the I-10 express lanes that are going on. West Valley Connector, we just finished Redlands Passenger Rail, 210 widening. California Transportation Commission, they administer a lot of the new grant programs under Senate Bill 1. They administer the State Transportation Improvement Program, which is a formula program that comes to SBCTA for allocation to projects. We, of course, coordinate with our local jurisdictions, the 24 cities in the county. We have Measure I formula programs that pass through monthly to them. We have some that are specific project allocations that we administer on a reimbursement basis. We have our 6 transit agencies, 5 bus operators and rail. that we're allocating funds to and entering into agreements with. So one thing I wanted to start with is to talk about constraints, because we've been hearing a lot of public comment lately in our meetings at the state level, why you need to take this money that you're investing on highway project A and put it on transit project B, or increase frequency on transit service. And there are constraints with what we can do based on the type of funding we receive. I was actually surprised to see that the majority of the funding we receive is dedicated to transit. And then on the other side, I want to talk about Measure I. 45% of the money is for local priorities. So either through a pass-through to local agencies or funding programs. 19% transit. Most of that is in the Valley area. 68% of the money in those areas gets passed through monthly to the cities for their local priorities. Another 25% is also for local road priorities, but those are more like expansion projects, regional projects. Only 5% there goes for transit.
A lot of different sides of equity, but there's also the broad side. So we grouped it into two basic bookends. Broad versus narrow classification is what we're calling it. Transit agencies do surveys, which we're thankful for. This is kind of like a national statistic that 75% of bus riders don't have access to a car for that trip. And I think the percentage is actually a little bit higher than that for Omnitrans. Metrolink, commuter rail, pre-COVID, that was about 15%. The 75% on the bus side, that's a critical mobility need. We took that kind of basic idea and the demographics and who uses the various services and drill down into our actual budget. But if you take the fund source and what it is actually used for, these are things that could possibly go into the equity budget. And it's a big number. We all know how critical that bridge is. Ray and others fought really, really hard to get highway bridge funding. So we could get that rebuilt because it wasn't going to last forever. Trucks were not able to use it anymore. We got West Valley Connector funding, and this includes operations as well as capital. But the bottom line is $500 million out of our budget. But we do have a bunch of targeted fare reductions for transit across the operators. They are targeted fare reductions, obviously students, senior and disabled, and so on. But every transit agency has the various programs, toll lanes that are forthcoming. And then we have some additional initiatives on air quality, transit being a big one. We're also doing a fair amount of work on clean trucks. We jointly did with RCTC and LA Metro on healthy communities, healthy economies, big air quality. We do have clean truck initiatives going on even as we speak on our I-10 project. We are funding through the SB1 Trade Gores program.
Our board back in 2021 adopted a resolution that really kind of put their mission in place. First thing we did was a regional equity study that really informed our environmental justice toolkit that we worked with planning on. And that equity study was prepared by the UCR Center for Social Innovation. And the intent was to really do an analysis of barriers to equity within the built environment. So looking at disadvantaged communities and their access or proximity to things like mobility, commuting time to work, open spaces, food deserts. Over the last year, we did a small business study. And really the goal here was to understand how our cities and the county engage in procurement activities. Additionally, the board just approved a contract with Ramey and Associates where we are going to develop an equity framework for SBCTA and SBCOG. And so what we're looking at doing is identifying opportunities within our processes and policies to focus and merge with those of the state and the federal government. From a COG perspective, we're also looking at every member and agency they have state identified disadvantaged communities. And we're looking for opportunities to engage with our community-based organizations and our NGOs.
Right, our transportation funding is based on how much fuel we use. It's the excise gas tax, and that gets funneled down to formula funding as well as competitive funding sources. And that has been declining for years. Funding gap as we continue to adopt electric vehicles, get more fuel efficient and reduce vehicle miles, that gap in picture and pressure on transportation funding just gets larger. Senate Bill 1, passed in 2017, was a game changer for California, increased not only the regular transportation revenues, but also created a number of new competitive programs. And the active transportation program is one of those key programs for multimodal projects. Funds in 2021 to 2023, the number of applications actually reduced, but the requesting amount increased, which means the projects got larger. We're seeing an increase in project cost, inflation, materials and supplies, project delays, the pressures to then address a multitude of issues with transportation projects, which increases the scope and size of projects. Grant applications, I think a lot of us know, is becoming more resource intensive. Basically, almost like developing a mini planning document level of analysis. Obviously, analyzing the impacts to disadvantaged communities for each project is critically important for every funding program. There's also support, on how to get planning studies and develop projects. Caltrans has a sustainable planning grant program, which is a significant program to help fund studies.